Good evening, everyone. My name is Malcolm Hackett. Welcome to our fourth Bushfire Resilience webinar of 2021, presented by Associate Professor Kevin Tolhurst, AM, from University of Melbourne, titled Triggers to Take Action. Bushfire Resilience Incorporated acknowledges the traditional custodians of the many lands from which you are joining us tonight, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples, their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. This webinar and the presenters are providing information, not advice. Every property and individual circumstance is unique, so it is your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. The topic of today's webinar may be sensitive for some people. Some services which offer support are shown on the screen. On behalf of BRI, I acknowledge the wonderful supporters and sponsors who have made these webinars possible. Bendigo Bank Community Bank branches, CFA, Nillumbik Shire Council, Safer Together, Rotary International Diamond Creek, and Davey Pumps and Irrigation. Now, normally I do a bit of an ad for the community banks, but I'd like to begin the webinar with a personal perspective by describing two incidents which I experienced on Black Saturday, which connect with tonight's topic. One which triggered the right response, and one which could have led to disaster. Diana and I live on a 230-acre property in Strathewen. We raise beef cattle and we grow hay. About 11 o'clock on the 7th of February 2009, I saw a column of smoke rising about 30 kilometres away near Mount Disappointment. I watched it for an hour, and with Premier Brumby's dire warning from the night before replaying in my head, I decided to round up our cattle, about 100 cows and calves, which were in the bush block about a kilometre away at the furthest point on the property. I guessed that if the fire did come our way, I would have other priorities and no time to make them safe. So I brought them back to a bare paddock near the house. I was very conscious that passers-by would see them standing in a hot, dusty paddock and think that it was an overreaction. Later in the afternoon, when the fire arrived in Strathewen, many of my neighbours' cattle and horses fled from the fire front, but were trapped at fences adjacent to the bush, or they perished in the scrub. After everything had burned and the danger had passed, I went to inspect the losses. To my amazement, the cattle were all there, still alive, huddled close together on the burned dirt. It's obvious they would have all died if they'd been left to fend for themselves. I was fortunate. I could just as easily have waited to see what would happen, but three triggers came into my consciousness and moved me to act early. The sight of smoke, the howling hot weather, and the Premier's warning. The second tale comes from the afternoon. About 3:30, warm bucks started dropping from the sky, and we knew it was only a matter of time before they would be glowing firebrands. Around 4 o'clock, a spot fire started on the creek flats, about 300 metres from the house. I took a knapsack sprayer and fought it, but I couldn't beat it. After 15 minutes, huge winds came swirling along the Arthurs Creek. The fire just lifted up and took off in two directions, towards the Kinglake Township in the northeast and St Andrews in the southeast. The grassy hills, the bush, the fence posts, everything was on fire. It was mesmerising. Then it struck me This isn't the fire, it's still coming. And Diana's back at the house on her own. I dropped the knapsack and ran flat out, arriving as the southwesterly change turned the fire front onto our southern boundary, engulfing the Strathuan Hall and then roaring across the paddock towards us. Our home, sheds and machinery were all destroyed. Not good. But the point of the story is this. The initial triggers were instinctive. See a fire, go and put it out. I didn't think about the consequences. I was lost in the moment, reacting to the immediate threat, and I had forgotten about the big picture. Enough of my stories. Now for some housekeeping. Thank you for registering and for submitting your questions. You'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator will group similar questions so we can cover as wide a range of subjects as possible. Please keep the questions short and to the point. We'll only be able to address questions which are on the webinar topic. You can see on your screen how we will use chat. Tonight's webinar will begin with Dr. Kevin Tolhurst from the University of Melbourne. Kevin will discuss a method to identify triggers for taking action in different circumstances. A panel discussion will follow involving Dr. Katherine Haynes from the University of Wollongong, Associate Professor Dr. Danielle Clode from Flinders University, and our panel convener, Dr. Raphaele Blanchi from the CSIRO. And then we'll have a Q&A. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. I'll just share my screen. So we're going to start this evening's session by doing a poll. So that the poll will be up for about 60 seconds. So the question of the poll is, consider your household is planning to travel for 12 months. Before leaving home, when would you start planning your trip, given that you're going to be away for that 12-month period and certain things are going to need to continue? So the answers, options are 2 hours before you leave, a day before, 3 months before, 6 months before, or 2 years before you go. So I'll leave you a few seconds so that you can answer the question. Okay, so we'll come back to those results and discuss them later. But for now, we'll continue with the my presentation. It comes up. So I specifically want to talk about setting triggers to take action for hilly terrain where we have forests and woodlands, because the triggers that you set will vary depending on where you sit in the topography, what the nature of the bushfire threat might be. So the first thing is that you need to appreciate that you're dealing with uncertainties. So don't expect to get precise information, whether it's from some fabulous app, whether it's from some reliable person, no matter how good you think those sources might be, there's always uncertainty in what you're being provided. So you have to make the decision yourself based on the best available information. And Malcolm gave a great example of bringing 3 sources of information together before he made his decision. But one of those observations was just his observation. So if you don't have a plan, though, those range of options, there's not much sense in having triggers, because your actions will be reactionary rather than working to some plan where you've already worked through what some potential scenarios might be. So you have to have a unique plan for you and your family. Everybody's situation is different, and every day that the plan may vary a little bit depending on the situation. So you can learn from others, but you can't just copy what others have done and hope that it'll work for you, because it's unique to you and your situation. So there's no simple solution to setting these triggers because we're dealing with complex and dynamic situations. So the triggers must be continually checked and acted upon. They're not set and forget. So don't wait to be told what to do, because no one is necessarily going to be any wiser than you are, in a sense. Take information on board, but appreciate that there's going to be a large level of uncertainty associated with that. So in setting the triggers, there's an assumption that you have this viable preparation, response, and recovery plan. It also assumes that you have access to and monitor the weather and the fire activity. So your assessment of a fire event and the response option that you take is sufficiently accurate and feasible. So it depends on your knowledge and your understanding of what's going on. So it's going to be, the triggers are going to be set based on your knowledge, your skills, your physical ability, your psychological ability, your equipment and other resources, the defendability of your property, your position in the landscape, the time before the various threats impact, the scale and severity of the fire, and the seasonal and weather conditions that you're facing at the time. There's a lot to take on board. So what is a trigger point anyway? Well, basically it's a point beyond which the chances of you being able to successfully implement your plan or your strategy will be unacceptably low. So you basically have to use the trigger to take action, but then you have to continually assess that and decide whether or not, in fact, you need to change your strategy, or perhaps even go and change the objective, what it is you're trying to achieve, so that you're continually working on something that is likely to be successful. There's no point in wishful thinking. You'll be found out if that's the case. So, for example, some broad options might be about leaving early, or it might be about preparing to stay and defend, or it might be about sheltering indoors, or in fact, it may even be about having to sell up and shift because you don't want to accept that level of risk. But there are a range of options, and each of those options then have further options beyond them. So leaving early is not just as simple as leaving early. There are where you leave to, when you leave, and so on. So in leaving early, what we're talking about is, have you planned enough time to pack all that you need if the house is destroyed? So documents, precious objects, animals, clothing, medication, phone, etc. Because it may be several days before you can get back to your house if your house has survived, or your house may in fact get destroyed. So you have to take account of that. Know where you're going. Where can you stay for the next 24 hours, or perhaps even the next few days? It's not just a matter of retreating for a few hours. You need to know what your route is and whether or not you have options to how you get to your safer place, and whether that safer place is available at the time. And leaving early, you also need to make sure that you've notified people who might be concerned for your welfare, because they may put their own life or at risk in trying to help you. If you're going to prepare and stay and defend, then you need to have a good idea of what the hazards are that you're going to face, so that you can prepare yourself and deal with those hazards. Know when to be outside, when to be inside. What happens if your primary shelter is damaged? What options do you have then? Know what mitigations can be taken and what backup options you may have if the preferred option fails. Know what to do if someone gets injured or becomes incapacitated for some reason. Know what to do if a stranger or a neighbour arrives looking for help. Know that it may be a few days before you can leave your property because access may be blocked. So if we go back to some of the hazards that we might be dealing with, there are the obvious fire-related hazards to do with perhaps the smoke, the embers, heat from the fire, flame contact, or fire-induced winds if the fire is large enough, and I'll talk about those a little bit more. But there are other hazards you need to consider as well. The ambient weather conditions. That may affect your body temperature and whether or not you're able to function the way you think you need to. There may be falling trees and branches because of strong winds. There may be, you may have pre-existing medical conditions. That's a hazard. The road there may be road accidents or road congestion that prevent you escaping as quickly as you think you might be able to. There may be poor communication, so you're not getting the information from outside sources that you might have expected to get. A neighbouring house or structure may be within 12 metres of your property, and if that's likely to burn, that's going to affect your ability to defend your property. So you need to consider what of those hazards affect you. And I would start off by saying that if you live in a bushfire management overlay area, then you need to have a written plan. So that's the first trigger point. Have a look to see whether the area you're assessed in has been assessed of being capable of carrying a high intensity fire. If you live in a bushfire prone area, then whether you have a written plan or not is probably a bit more optional. But the advantage of writing it down is it forces you to think about what goes into that plan and forces you to look at the rationale behind it a bit more. Then it's a matter of, are you really bushfire ready? Have you actually done all the preparation you need? Because when the time comes, there's a limit to how much you can actually achieve at that time, so you need to be well prepared. So one of the things might be, can I accept a loss of my property? Am I adequately insured? Do I have other options? Do I have savings? Maybe the loss of the property is not the worst thing that could happen to you. And have I done sufficient work, preparation, to increase the chances of me and my family surviving? So your life, there's no point having your house surviving if you lose your life. And you may lose your life through a heart attack rather than necessarily through a direct fire loss. So they're big picture issues, but beyond that, when we get closer to an event, the response options you might have might be to leave early, to prepare, stay and defend, or shelter indoors. So let's look a little more at that. So some of the assumptions about these triggers are, have you really thought through what you're planning to do and what all your options might be, your fallback options? You've got to have a number of options. So a realistic visualization of what could happen is really important. Have you made all the necessary preparations that will mitigate against those hazards so that there's far less to do in the event of a fire? What about the response triggers? Will they enable you to choose the most preferred response option that you have to make the probability of success greatest? So your response triggers, do they provide enough time for you to successfully implement your plan rather than just being last minute decisions or you having too much to do given the time available? And I would suggest that a response trigger needs to give you at least a 2-hour leeway before any of those hazards impact on you. So the 2 hours gives you a little bit of wriggle room if there is some unforeseen thing happen on your way out. You may find a person on the side of the road. There may be an accident. There may be a tree across the road. You need some lead time. And at the very least, I would suggest is 2 hours. When we're talking about the weather conditions associated with property loss, a lot of people get driven by total fire bans or the declaration of a code red or catastrophic fire danger rating. This graph shows the blue dots are a whole lot of fire events and the number of houses that have been lost during those fire events. If we actually look at the area under the graph, you see in a lot of cases we can have really severe fire weather, but very few houses and lives are lost because the fires occur in areas where there aren't very many people or houses. However, the red dashed line at the top is basically showing us the potential for loss. And what I would like to just point out to you here is that the even down under very high fire danger rating, we could have hundreds of houses lost. So we shouldn't just be focused on the code red catastrophic conditions or even total fire ban conditions. We need to be looking at broader range of conditions. And it may be, for example, we have no intention of necessarily leaving on a very high fire danger day, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a fire start a couple of kilometres away from our property and burn into us within a very short period of time. So we still need to have done a considerable amount of preparation and planning. So the catastrophic impact is much, goes well beyond the worst fire weather conditions. So this table is a fair bit to take in on this table, but this table gives you a bit of a guide to work out some times and distances. So what I'm saying is for a fire danger rating of very high, the rate of spread of a forest fire will be about 2 kilometres an hour. Spotting distance is about 10 kilometres away from the fire front. So your proximity trigger, a fire within 5 kilometres of you, you'll have less than 2 hours to respond before embers, smoke, or whatever will start to impact you. So under a very high fire danger condition, you'll be interested in fires that occur inside or outside this 5 kilometre zone. If we go up to the code red conditions where the fire danger rating is similar to what it was on Black Saturdays, we see it's going to be a total fire ban day. The rate of spread of fire might be 12 kilometres an hour. The spotting distances might be 30 kilometres. So we ought to be interested in fires that would be up to 30 kilometres away. So how does that look? If we take an example of an area near North Warrandyte, I've just picked a random house here. What we see is this random house is on a dead-end road. To get out of this area, we're going to have to go through a lot of intersections, a lot of tree-lined streets, the potential for a lot of intersecting traffic, and we've got to go across the river down here. There's a single bridge, and it's the only bridge for quite some distance. So there are a lot of reasons why that escape route or that exit route won't work for us if we have strong winds that might be blowing a tree across, or if fire starts to impact the area. So this is even though it's not very far in kilometres, it could be an impossible route to get out of there in the passage of a fire. And that's the importance of leaving early. And when I say leave early, I don't mean that you plan to evacuate or leave 2 hours before. And what I mean is you're sitting in the car, starting the engine 2 hours before you go, not start packing the car up. So if we look at that random house and look at 5 kilometre, 10 kilometre, 20, 30 kilometre radiuses, so those distances are relating to embers or flame fire travel under different fire danger indices. And then we take into account the forecast weather conditions. We might see the area of interest that we have. So we might say down here to the south, we're not particularly interested in that because there's no fuel, it's an urban area. We're expecting northerly winds with a southwesterly change. So this is the area within which we're really particularly interested in fires occurring. If the weather forecast was different and the winds were coming perhaps more from the west, we would change that area of interest. We're not so interested in an area, a fire starting over here, because the likelihood of getting to us is almost zero, probably is zero. Just zooming in, we might identify a few places that we could go to. So we might have a couple of neighbourhood safer places, which are places of last resort. So they're probably not the best places to go to. But we may have identified from our random house up here that there's an area here, it might be a shopping centre or it might be a friend's place. Likewise down here, there may be someone that we can go to. We have a couple of options at least as to places that we might go under conditions where we can stay for 24 hours or several days if we need to. The neighbourhood safer place obviously is not somewhere that you could stay for 24 hours or for several days. So we need to think about that and where those areas are and how long it might take us to get there under extreme conditions where there might be an accident on the road, trees across the road, and so on. If we look at a specific example like on Black Saturday, this is a reconstruction of the fire. So this was about 4 o'clock, well, in fact, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. What we can see here is that it's beyond the 30 kilometre boundary here, but it's moving so rapidly that it already is potentially threatening to our property down here in North Warrandyte because it's within 2 hours, potentially 2 hours of reaching us. So if we were going to leave early, we needed to have been leaving before 3 o'clock that day. given the fire situation there, because the fire was about 40 kilometres away from us at that time. But it quickly gets to us. In this particular case, the wind change came through a bit earlier, and so the direct impact on the house didn't occur, but that's not true of many other areas a little distance to the north. So that fire certainly is within that zone of interest for us in terms of the zone of concern for setting our triggers. So when we're looking at our triggers as well, we need to consider, well, how viable is the option to stay and defend under the forecast or the expected weather conditions. So here's a house, different house to that random house I was looking at before, but we can see there's been some radiation barriers put in there. There's some metal structures, sheds close to the house. We've got sort of 10 to 15 metres of cleared area around here. We have to assess how defendable is that house. So a lot of work and thought has gone into this house in terms of its defence, but we're still likely to be subjected to embers and radiation from fire in the surrounding forest area here. And again, we can see this is a dead-end road attached to a gravel road. There's no quick exit from here. And likewise, it's no, the likelihood of getting ambulances or fire services in to assist is very limited, especially if it's a large fire and there's a lot else going on. So one of the things that we might consider in terms of the hazards are the embers and the potential for firestorms. This is showing a map of Victoria where firestorms are most likely to occur. The blue line here is showing outline of Nillumbik. What you can see, the northern side of Nillumbik, there are areas there potentially could be subjected to firestorm conditions. So this is where embers would be dropped from a rapid run of a fire up a steep hill. And what I'm saying is a hill that has about at least a 300 metre increase in elevation. And within a 5 kilometre area downwind of that, you could accept a firestorm to potentially develop. Strathewen that Malcolm was talking about was an example of an area that fits into that category. Fire-induced winds can often be underestimated. Here is where we get a large enough fire to basically produce cyclone strength winds close to the in the fire ground. So what's our potential to have these large fire events? And they're more likely to be under the most severe weather conditions, but we need to be prepared for them. We might think we're well prepared for a fire under a severe or extreme day, but perhaps not under a code red day. And here's an example of what those fire-induced winds can do to trees. Snap them off. They blow roofs off houses, they blow doors in, they blow windows in. Your house that you might have thought was a refuge, in fact, may be a refuge no longer, or we may get fallen trees and branches falling on the house as well, so compromising the structure. There's people like myself that have pre-existing medical conditions. And I would say, you might think you're relatively strong and fit, but my question would be, can you split wood for 4 hours in 40 degrees heat, fully clothed? Because that's sort of the amount of strenuous activity that you may be required to undertake to defend a property. I would say for me, I can't do that. But I might be able to do it under milder conditions. So where's your limit that is realistic rather than just optimistic? You may have other pre-existing medical conditions related to your lungs, to your heart. You may have stress and psychological issues as well. And it's just interesting as well, I've just written down here, about 50% of firefighter fatalities are due to cardiac arrest. They're not being burnt. They're basically, the stress is so much that they have heart attacks. Ambient weather. Again, if you've got temperatures of greater than 40 degrees, it's quite possible for your body to overheat. And once that starts to happen, you make bad decisions, your body collapses. So being able to operate under high temperatures is a difficult thing to do. So there has to be rest, has to be hydration. There's a number of factors that need to be taken into account. We may lose communication. So that means that if we're reliant on electronic forms of communication, we may be sadly disappointed come the event. So we need to also be able to rely on making useful observations ourselves. And trying to observe what's happening 20 or 30 kilometres away is very difficult. So even using observations can be difficult. So you need to have contingencies for when those communications break down. If we're expecting to be able to use the roads, there are all sorts of reasons why roads won't be open. Trees across them, smoke across them, a road accident, and so on. So to try and sum up, a plan must have meaningful triggers, and triggers without a plan is basically meaningless. So the plan must have optional strategies to deal with varying current and expected situations. Each person, each family, each property must have their own plan and the associated triggers with it. It has to be customised. And it has to be customised to today. The plan you have today may not be suitable for tomorrow. If any trigger is pulled, you must then either mitigate it or move to the next option. So triggers should be based on a good understanding of what the risks are that you're facing and the values you're trying to protect. And they must be based on a good understanding of the weather, the fire, and what that impact might have on you. And the alternative to that is lurching from crisis to crisis in a reactive manner. And we've seen many videos, books, stories written, seeing people doing exactly that, and they're lucky. If you want to put your life and your property into the category of hope for the best and luck, then you're really playing with fire, as they say. It's unforgiving. And there's no simple solution to a complex and dynamic situation such as fires. So triggers must be continually checked and responded to. So we need to have cascading options to be realistic to deal with this complexity. All right, thank you for that. So what we're going to do now is a second poll. So we'll put this poll up, and again, we'll have about 60 seconds. So what information source do you use as your main trigger to leave early? So this is just your main trigger. So forecast weather and fire danger, an official warning from emergency services app, family and friends or neighbours, seeing or smelling the smoke, seeing embers and flames, or you don't intend to leave early.
We're going to move to a panel discussion, and Raphaele is going to chair.
Thanks, Malcolm. Can we just first, for starting this discussion session, have the result of the first poll? So if it's not coming, I can give you the result. I think I've kept some notes on that. So the question was, how much time do you need to plan a trip of 12 months before you go? And the most popular option was 6 months, with 56% of the people responding that was saying that's where their options. And we have also 31% that were saying 2 years of preparation. So quite a long time of preparation. And I think that's a good point as well. A few years back, I went on a big trip in Western Australia, around Western Australia with my family. And we started to plan it like 8 months before the departure. And first we were thinking about the big questions, what car do we need? Where are we going to sleep? Do we need a tent? Do we need a camper trailer? And then closer to our departure, we starting looking at the smaller things, like, do we really need a coffee grinder? Which we did take with us, and it was fantastic. But reflecting back on our trip and how it's related to the planning for bushfire, I think that looking at the big picture and the strategic planning at the start was really the most critical for us, and was really, really important and to be part of our plan. So Kevin, first question maybe for you, following your presentation. So why do you think it's so essential to have a plan, and how, when should we start planning, and how we can identify the triggers in our plan?
Yeah, look, I think the process of, it's not the plan that's important, it's the process we go through in developing the plan. So as you've just described, Rafi, you need some time to think about all the things you've forgotten about. So whether it's the coffee pot, or whether it's the fact that usually in the middle of the year, I get some firewood, and if I don't get the firewood before I leave, then it's not going to be there when I get back, and I'll have lost the opportunity. So the plan forces you to go through all the possible scenarios that you can think of. It allows you to communicate that with other people in your family and your neighbours, so that you can also understand, get a joint shared understanding of where you're coming from. And once you're clear as to what your options are and the various scenarios that you can think of, then you can start to set the triggers as to when you might implement those various plans or options. So we do it relatively naturally for many other things in our lives, but for bushfires, often we put it off in the background and don't think about it so much because it's too hard. But in fact, it's not too hard. It's just, it is complex, but we need to take the preparations, because not all fires are big fires like on 2009. Some of them occur within a couple of hours of starting and could impact on us. So even a fire under a very high fire danger condition could be life-threatening and could destroy our house. So we've got the statistics that basically show that lots of houses have been burnt under those conditions. It might be 10%, but it might be my 10%, if you like. So the plan is really important to have those discussions and work through what the options are, so you can put triggers in to know when you're going to go down those various lines of options.
Yeah, having a plan is very important, like you mentioned. So Kat, from your research, how many people have a plan or have made preparations? And what are the challenges that stop people from having a plan that's so important?
So a lot of the research on people having plans depends on what you classify as a plan. And quantitative research that we've done has often come up with a percentage on this that's fairly high. For example, our Black Saturday questionnaire found that 69% of people claim to have a firm plan at the beginning of that fire season. But what our in-depth qualitative interviews that we've conducted show is the huge variability in the quality of people's plans. So there's a lot of people who will say they have a plan when asked, and they might say, oh yes, my plan is to leave, but that's not a plan, it's just an intention. And when we question them further, it becomes clear that there is no detailed planning around that intention. It's just what they think they'll do, but not how they'll do it. What are their triggers to go? What do they need to pack and prepare? What will they take their horse or other pets? Where will they go? How will they get there? What are their contingency or backup plans if plans A, B, or C don't work? Having a number of contingency and backup plans is something that we've seen is really important. So there are many things that can change, even how you feel on the day, to what day of week it is, if the children are in school or not, who is home, and importantly, who may be able to get home. One theme which comes out really strongly from all the interviews we've done is that different family members have different visions of the plan or different views of what should be done when the reality of a bushfire actually threatens. These disagreements often lead to different outcomes. As seen from this quote, where a male respondent from Flowerdale talks about him and his partner and how he ended up leaving rather than defending. My plan was actually to stay, and I probably would have, but she wouldn't leave. And then in the end, I wasn't happy for her to drive on the road anyway. I would have liked her to have gone very early in the day, but she wouldn't leave. So that probably altered my opinion on staying right through to the end. The main thing that stops people having a plan is that they don't think they're at risk of a bushfire. Like the New South Wales Tarthra fires in 2018, it's a seaside town where the majority did not think they were at risk and they didn't have a plan. And to make matters worse, many didn't receive a warning that a fire was coming. During the 2019-20 bushfires, some people were under threat for weeks and in some cases months. What we saw was that people's plans became more refined as they were tested and applied learnings and had significant time to prepare. What we also saw was that some who planned to stay and defend ended up evacuating as they realized the enormity of what they were facing and that they physically and mentally were not up for it. That due to the dryness of the landscape and the expected fire weather, they could not defend. We also saw people who were planning to evacuate actually have the time to prepare and end up defending. So the conversations we've had with people after the recent and long drawn out Black Summer fires were with people who had developed a really good appreciation of the risks and had a well tried and tested plan. So the question is, how do you get to this point without going through a long drawn out fire season?
Yeah, very good point. How you try to instigate those feelings when we're not in the fire season, so people can start to develop those plans and get prepared and ready for the bushfire. So Danielle, you live close to St. Andrew and you were threatened by the Black Saturday fire. Now you live in South Australia and you've been facing some of the recent fire. So tell us about a bit of your experience. What was, your plans? Where you trigger, and how did it work for you?
Well, I guess the main thing is that my triggers and my plans that change with the circumstances I'm in and the my family basically. So when we first moved to our house in Victoria, we did choose it knowing that fire was a big issue. So we chose a south-facing block. Various features that might have made it a little bit less risky, but it was still a high-risk property surrounded by forest. And so when my children were very small, when they were babies, I left every total fire ban day because that was the recommendation. And so that was a matter of leaving first thing in the morning every total fire ban day that was declared. I have to say I was the only person I knew who ever did that. I didn't ever meet anyone else who did that. It would have made my life a lot easier if other people had done it as well. Perhaps we could have done something together. So we'd go to the cinema, or we'd go to an indoor playground, or we'd go visit friends. It wasn't too bad when my children were small. It became more complex when my children were in school. And so that added an extra layer of complexity, and our triggers and plans had to change, but still we would mostly leave the area. And then as my children got older and we put more investment in protecting the property, making it safer, putting in sprinklers, doing the clearances, putting in other plans, I decided that we would stay and defend, which is what we did on Black Saturday, which possibly with hindsight wasn't the best decision. And that probably resulted in us moving house. And we ended up in South Australia, and we bought a block and built a fire safe house, which has then changed our plans again. So now our plan is always to stay and defend, but now I have a custom built house in the middle of a cleared block, and with 3 or 4 adults at home. But again, those triggers will change and those plans will change. And if I was to leave early, if one of us was ill, I would again leave the night before or the very early in the morning on the day, and I would not return until late at night when it was clear that any risk was reduced. So I think that recognition that things are going to change through your lifetime, depending on your personal circumstances, has been really important to me in the decisions I make, and they constantly change depending on the season.
Yeah, that's good, and that's reflect as well what Kevin was, discussing and presenting a bit. Things change and how we can adapt and how we can take that into account, and being very proactive in that way. So I think we've been talking a bit now about the plan, but can we try to explore a bit more? When do we act? When's the time do we have to do something? So maybe some of the first things I'd like to explore with Kat is we've been talking about leaving early, but what does leaving early mean, and what are the consequences of leaving it too late? Kat, can you tell us a bit more about that, and how people can understand it in relation with their context and their own circumstances as well?
So leaving early means different things to different people. To emergency services, it means leaving the day before or early on the day of all catastrophic or code red days. Residents interpret this differently given their individual circumstances and perceptions of the risk to their lives and their properties, and also their ease of egress to safe areas. It also depends for many if there are already fires burning in the landscape that could then become threatening. If there are no fires burning, then people may wait to see. During the recent Black Summer fires, we saw many people who have dependents and animals such as horses leave early and make preparations to keep their children and animals safe. We also saw this become so inconvenient that people moved and stayed elsewhere or moved their animals semi-permanently as the back and forth became too difficult. Of course, there are many people for whom this is just not an option, and it becomes a balance of inconvenience against the risk. With climate change and a likelihood of more long drawn out fire seasons, this is something we have to consider. I think we all know what the consequences are of leaving too late. It means facing dangers in the landscape, flames, falling trees, inability to see due to smoke, car accidents. In recent times, we've seen a high percentage of deaths of those evacuating late, either in vehicles or on foot. People want more certainty in relation to the level of risk they face. They want confirmation that their actions warrant the risks faced. What we saw with the recent Black Summer fires was a huge reliance on smartphone apps to provide an almost real-time mapping of the fire front, predicted path of the fire front and ember attack. Despite the interviewees saying that the level of information and detail they received from the RFS was the best they have ever had, they still wanted more detail, more localized, more timely, and more accurate information. They wanted to know precisely when the fire front would arrive, if their property would be impacted, and when they should take action. That is an absolute natural expectation, and technology improves all the time, but unfortunately, it also fails. What then in the absence of any information at all? If we come to rely on official warnings to evacuate and then we don't get one? A recent study by the CFA found that 70% of residents expected a formal warning to evacuate. In Tathra in 2018, many residents received little or no warning at all. For many, it was seeing and smelling smoke that alerted them, embers landing in their gardens and flames on the edge of their properties. There was no option for these residents to leave early. It was a dangerous fire weather day, but it was also March and near the very end of the fire season, and there were no fires burning. What then for leaving early? What then for people who only rely on apps and official warnings to take action? We must not lose our ability to understand the landscape and fire weather and make our own interpretations, and also understand that we may not always be able to leave early.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that you said, Ian. So understanding, the weather and our circumstances as well, that's going to help to make this decision. So it's really trying to see like what are the different circumstances in our environments, like the vegetations and being in a high-risk area, having weather, but also the other circumstances in your life, like that's what's going to happen on the day. So maybe if we go trying to tease that a little bit more, starting by the environmental circumstances that you're going to be facing. And Kevin, you talk a bit about them, like, are we in a high-risk area? What's the weather's going to look like? I think it's quite important to understand exactly what I was just saying, like this, what the fire will look like at our place and in different weather conditions and different weather situations. So try to understand how bad it's going to be depending on the day. So Kevin, can you give us maybe some example of what the fire look like under the Black Saturday conditions compared to the another type of fire under severe weather conditions? What can we expect, and what would be the implications on our plan and on our decision with those two extremes?
Yeah, I think if we take two extreme examples to start with, if we look at what happened on Black Saturday, where the fires basically started on the morning or the early afternoon of the day, and then caused all that destruction within a few hours, really, within probably a 12-hour window. That is a different situation to what happened in Canberra, for example, where the fires had been burning for over a week in the mountains behind, and then there was a blow-up day, a severe fire weather day. It was, well, when I say severe, it was from a fire danger rating point of view, it was code red or catastrophic day. And so you had warning, in a sense, of that potential fire because the fire already existed. So one of the things that Katherine was saying is very relevant here is that you may get caught out under less than those most severe conditions, and you still need to be prepared. So the Tathra example is a great one where even if your plan is to leave early, you may not have enough warning, no matter how good the apps and so on might be. You may not have the time to do that. So you have to have a plan that will work if you are caught out with a fire. It may not necessarily be even defending your property, but it may still be finding somewhere safer to go during the passage of the event, or it may be in fact defending your property. So the fire that I've tried to explain is there are more factors than just the flames and the smoke. There's also the winds associated with it, and there's the just the temperature of the day and so on that affects our metabolic capacity. There's the fatigue that we might already have from not sleeping very well at night. All of those things add to it. It's not just about the flame. So the app is not going to tell you that. The app might tell you where the fire front is, but it won't necessarily tell you when you're likely to be impacted. So the triggers that you're looking for need to take those sort of things into account. And if you don't really understand the fire environment that you're living in and what the potential is, then that's a dangerous position to be. It's like driving a car without knowing what the controls really do. So the controls for fire are the terrain, the weather, the fuels, the combination of those, and the environmental conditions or the drought conditions that might exist. So you've got to package all those up. It's not a simple thing, and I think what Katherine was describing there is that you need to be prepared for a range of conditions, because no two situations are going to be exactly the same. So if there's an existing fire in the landscape, leaving early means going the day before. If there's bad weather coming along but no fires, I would suggest that you need to be leaving before 10 o'clock in the morning, or putting your plan into action at least 2 hours before any of the hazards arrive, particularly the fire. So yeah, it's difficult to give a definitive answer, but that's because of the complexity of the situation you're dealing with. So I don't think I've really answered your question that well.
I think that's good. That's good. I think we that was really decided to understand, the environmental circumstances, what's the fire's going to look like, and that's one of the complexity. But when we look at the other complexity is what's happening in your life at the time on the day. And that's, maybe let's talk a little bit about that, like, who is at your place? Are you feeling okay? Do you have any other issue that's prevent you maybe to put your plan in place? So I'd like to ask Kat first and then Danielle about that. But should we adjust our plan and triggers to our situation on the day and take into account first our physical capabilities? Maybe that's a question for Kat, and then we look at the psychological capabilities with Danielle.
Yeah, plans and triggers for action should be continually refined and in a state of continual planning. As we saw in the recent fires, people's plans changed completely from the beginning of the fire season as the disaster unfolded, as people came to fully understand the risks and the dangers because of the dry conditions and the fire weather. They reevaluated what their plans were. And even in Black Saturday, the fires came following a period of extreme heat, and people were already feeling exhausted before the fires hit from preparations for bushfires, or really just from carrying on day-to-day activities during an intense heat wave. So also plans change as the years go by, and I recently interviewed a couple on a rural property who'd always stayed to defend. They were well prepared and they had experience, but in Black Summer, they realized that they just couldn't do it anymore. They were now too elderly and had to evacuate instead, and evacuation was something that they just had never planned for that. And another interview that will probably always stay with me is of a wife and mother who planned to leave early while the others stayed to defend. And despite evacuating early as planned, she then returned as the trauma of leaving the others behind was just too great. And she wanted to try one last time to try and get them to evacuate. And she ended up driving through the flames and was really lucky to survive. So she wasn't psychologically ready to leave her adult son and husband behind. And that trauma was not something that she'd considered in her planning.
Yeah, that's really important aspect. So what do you think, Danielle, about those trying to include these psychological capabilities as well in our plan and triggers?
Yeah, look, it's really incredibly difficult to be psychologically prepared because, you know, as Kat has explained, there's many things we don't predict are going to emotionally affect us on the day. I mean, I guess one of the things I think is quite important is to imagine that you're going to be on your own. We often tell people, remember, there may not be a truck coming to save you, and so you have to plan to protect, you know, to do whatever you're doing without anybody telling you what to do. So you should just always assume that no one else will be helping you make your decisions, no one else will be helping you with your plans. Really, you need to be thinking about what happens if I'm completely on my own in this situation. And I think that often helps people to understand how they're going to react emotionally, because they're just thinking about themselves. They're not relying on anybody else or any outside support, a partner, family, authority figures, you know, fire trucks, anyone else, just all on your own. If you can do that, then you're probably prepared psychologically. And I guess also just embedding all your activities so that, you know, embedding them in your regular daily activities so that you're completely familiar with them, and you're that's a way of getting it into your head, so that you're able to do those things just as part of your everyday activities, your seasonal preparations, your garden activities. I think the more you can do that, the better prepared, and the easier the triggers are, because the triggers are well in advance of the fire. They're not associated with the fire, they're just part of your summer activities, I suppose. And yeah, I guess it's just about how we respond to those situations, and trying to mimic stress, I think, is really difficult. But one technique you can use is to run through one of your fire preparation, whether it's getting out the hoses and watering, you know, hosing down something or other, some vulnerable asset, but do it with a time limit. So give yourself a minute and a half to get all that done. Put yourself under pressure, and you'll soon work out how you react under pressure and the mistakes you make and how difficult that is to do. So create artificial stress for yourself, and then run through it. And of course, you know, doing it on a hot day, lots of hot clothes, with scratch sunglasses and some really horrible heavy metal music playing really loudly in your ears. And you'll find that you can mimic that stress, and you'll start to appreciate how difficult those activities are and how much easier you need to make them for yourself. So there's ways we can mimic that psychological preparation that we need to do. But yeah, thinking through those scenarios, doing stuff on your own, and as Kat mentioned, that's a really great example, I think, of the kind of unexpected things that trip us up.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and I think you developed those points like in the webinar 3 as well, where let's discuss more the psychological aspect and the practice, you know, practice. What was some of the word that were coming out from the seminar? So I advise people, if they haven't looked at it, to have a look at this one. So I think we're getting towards the end, but we still have one poll questions. The second poll question that's wanted to discuss, like the informations that we use for trigger to act. So yes. If Rowan, are you sharing them with everybody? I'm not sure if it's visible. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for that. I wasn't sure. So some of the response very overwhelmingly, it's the forecast weather and the fire danger rating. The official warning is also another aspect that people use, and very little response were using information from friends, seeing or smelling smoke, and seeing an amber on flames, which is quite interesting to see that in relation to maybe some of the research and the results from the research as well that maybe you've seen. Kat, do you want to start to discuss a bit of some of the results and see what does that bring to you? What advice we can give people in relation? That's the result of the poll.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because that's what I expected. Is, you know, it's good to see that for most people it's the forecast weather, or the fire danger rating, which is right. The official warnings at nearly 30%. I think, you know, that's probably what we've seen in previous research, and that the others are very low. But I think the reality is, when a bushfire threatens, and we know this because when we ask people, you know, how did you first become aware that there was a bushfire? It's because they smelt smoke or saw smoke, or they saw embers, or it was because a family or a neighbor or a friend told them to. So overwhelmingly, when the bushfire happens, it's because they find out about it from those other factors. But the fact that people are, you know, that their main trigger would be they're looking for that forecast weather is great.
Yeah, that's great. So Kevin, anything on those results that you want to add?
Well, I think the official warnings and the weather forecasts are really useful sources of information, but you just need to be able to apply that. What does that mean for you in your situation? And don't just look at the fire situation. As I say, if there were going to be strong winds, then that could bring branches or trees down on roads and cause havoc. Likewise, if it's just going to be hot and dry, that's going to affect your ability to be able to do physical work. So whether it's packing the car or whether it's trying to defend the house. So they are critical things, but I think often in the research, most people will use 2 or 3 cross-checked pieces of information. I think that's right, Catherine. So we've only asked for one here, but the reality is it is a good idea to actually cross-reference your sources. And personally, I'd be paying a lot of attention to the signs, the smoke, the winds, how much the trees blowing around and so on, and combining that with what has been forecast to see if they match up, because sometimes the conditions can actually be much worse than forecast, and sometimes it's vice versa.
Yeah, no, the environmental cues definitely quite important, and having this understanding, I think, of our environments, like being able to notice what's happening outside, it's really important on that. Danielle, what's your thoughts on those results as well?
Yeah. I think again, you just got to assume you will not get a warning. You've got to assume that, you know, I mean, it's obviously you should be watching the weather so that you know what the fire danger is. But, you know, sometimes the fire that burnt my property didn't have any bad weather. It was a very mild day. So it wasn't really a high risk situation at all. And the first warning I've got for the three fires that threatened my property recently in the last couple of years has been the smoke. And that's just, you know, a smoke in the distance coming up. So, you know, you have to hope that you get a warning, but assume that you won't. That's just, you've just got to be constantly patrolling on high risk days, wandering around, having a look, keeping an eye out, not sitting in the air conditioning with the blinds down. You can do that, but you've got to go outside and have a look as well.
I think that's where, Danielle, it's important. That's while you're out looking, that's when you're perhaps raking up some leaves, sorting out the noses of your taps, sort of looking at whether or not things are falling on the roof of the house and so on. So that's one of those preparedness activities that you get used to doing. Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, thanks. So we have a bit of a wrap-up summary of the 4 of us. I think we wanted to share, but being 8:34, and I think we need to stick to the to the schedule. So maybe we can move to the Q&A, and then we can do this wrap-up all at the end, if that's okay with you, Malcolm.
Certainly, and thanks. You've given us an awful lot to think about there. So let's move on to our questions. We've had people lining up here. Often the Central District danger rating is dominated by grass fire danger west of Geelong, where the GFDI can be 60, while the forest fire danger index in Warrandyte Kangaroo Ground is only 25. So the district danger rating is different. And it unnecessarily activates the leave early triggers for local residents. One person said they've overcome this data on a restricted access section of the Bureau of Meteorology website to check up on what the forest fire danger index is, but it's not publicly available. Would it be appropriate to make this sort of information more easily available to the general public?
Well,
Kevin, sounds like one for you.
I certainly think it should be more available. There are some really good products out there now, which basically shows a map of those fire danger ratings across country, in fact, but certainly across the state. that mapping of those fire danger ratings ought to be readily available. As the person asking the question says, I get access to them. I have access to them, but everyone should have access to those so that they can sort of see what stage their plan needs to be at, what level of activation they should be triggering. So yeah, I fully agree that more of that information, but it's in a mapping form.
Danielle, you want to say something?
I just wanted to say the research is pretty clear on this, that the more information people have, the better in disaster preparation. So we shouldn't just assume, we shouldn't just be tailoring to the lowest common denominator. We need to be providing as much information as possible for people, and that will help them make better decisions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I'm always amazed now when I'm interviewing people. You know, there are so many people out there who have had so much experience of bushfires. They're pretty much experts in terms of getting, you know, all the information and finding the information they need. So yeah, I absolutely agree that, you know, we should put all that information out there.
I think one of the counter things that's going on is people rely on total fire ban declarations or code red catastrophic day declarations, and that's a dangerous thing to rely on as well, because you can have life-threatening situations outside those sort of conditions.
Now this next question, I think it's a lowdown misere. The person says, unless all parties involved agree on the actions and timing of the plan is effectively of no value. Comment, please.
Good one for Danielle.
Yeah, well, I think Kat probably knows a lot about this as well. Yeah, we obviously know that there's a lot of differences of opinion, and it does directly lead to fatalities. I don't know if Kat, you've got more to say on that.
Yeah, we see it all the time. You know, different members of the family have got different ideas, and also they might agree at the time when they're sitting down at the kitchen table in the middle of winter, you know, thinking about their bushfire plan. But then when it's on and there's a bushfire threatening, suddenly, you know, the reality hits and they realize, you know, one person's like, well, I don't think we should stay and defend anymore, and I want to go, or I'm not leaving without you, as we see that all the time. So I think it's really hard for, you know, different people, even though they're from the same family and different genders, to absolutely agree on what the plan should be. Yeah,
and people have different value, I suppose. That's make a difference in the way they're going to assess the situations. And even though, like Kathy mentioned, they made a plan before things change, and that's really hard to reconcile for them. We see it in some other interviews as well. Yeah.
I think one of the strengths of putting a plan together is that at least it allows you to have some discussions over these things, even though hopefully you can reconcile it. But the planning process is more important than the plan itself.
Now this is a sort of a technical question. With the Vic emergency website and app, what's the typical lag time between a fire emerging and being tagged on the website or the app? And does the volume of notifications mean that some people will receive the messages much later than others, and perhaps too late? And if any of you don't know the answer to that, perhaps we can ask Rowan, who's in the back room. Any ideas?
Technically, I can't tell you, but it's much better than it used to be. Rowan might be able to give us some specific answers.
Yeah. Sorry. To be honest, it's all the information comes out at exactly the same time. There's a lot of factors that are involved in terms of the level of your internet connection and things like that. But ultimately, at the front end of it, all the information comes out. So we've had situations, I guess, from a CFA point of view, where we've actually seen the incident reported on the Vic Emergency app before we've actually received the page to actually respond to the job. So there's no real pattern, but I agree with Kevin, it's hugely faster than it has been, and it's just getting better as each year goes on.
Thanks, Rowan. Now this next question, when making regular checks outside on a high risk day, is there a certain compass direction that is most of the risk for bushfire threat? In other words, fire threats from the north due to hot northerly winds.
Well, I might start with that. Look, just in southeast, well, in Victoria, I guess the main pattern of weather that we're going to get is going to give us winds somewhere between north and northwest ahead of a southwesterly change, which could go around as far as the south. So that sort of gives us 180 degrees that we need to be concerned about. So, but that situation changes if you're in New South Wales or Queensland or not so much. South Australia is fairly similar to here. So you need to understand what your weather patterns are associated with those high fire danger conditions. We saw some fires a few years ago come fairly heavily from the east down in Gippsland. So it was driven really by weather conditions off the east coast. That's pretty unusual, but it's not impossible. So there is a general pattern, but don't rely on that being hard and fast.
Maybe I would add when the fires eventually, or the embers eventually arrive on your house, it's where you need to look all, at 360 degrees around your house, because everything can catch on fire and everything can spread fire to other part of your property or part of your house as well. So at that time, it's looking everywhere and looking at what are the most vulnerable part of your property, the fuel and the combustible that can help the fire spreading to your house, for example.
And there's also a risk of relying too much on prevailing weather conditions. So people will expect fires to come from one particular direction when, local topography has a big impact, also proximity to vegetation, but mainly just the sheer unpredictability of fires. Often hear my neighbours talk about how they expected it to come from one direction where the weather comes from, but it actually came across the road from another direction because it wasn't windy and for whatever reasons. And other people who live, on hilltops, the fire will come from 3 or 4 different directions over the course of a few hours. So it's just too variable. So you can plan for the most common option, but you have to be prepared for it coming from the most unexpected place.
Thanks, Danielle. That was certainly the experience for lots of people in Strathearn. This next person says they're not currently in a bushfire risk area, and they're aware that a suburban neighbourhood has areas with high fuel loads, homes really close together, lots of fuels in timber fences and street trees and gardens close together and so on. If a fire is in the outer area, it could quickly get into the suburbs. How fast would a fire move in that situation on an extreme fire weather day? And is this in the planning for managing bushfires, a bushfire actually hitting the suburbs? This person reckons most of their neighbours wouldn't have a clue about what to do. And I guess that comes back very much to the Canberra experience.
Yeah.
Kevin, do you want to kick off, or sorry, who was going to jump in?
I can start, but Kevin, if you
no, go for it.
I can start talking about the Canberra experience. Like, we've seen house that's 700 meters from the fire edge, that's where catch on fire and then where burned out. So that's one of the biggest distance that we've seen in fire where house were affected by the fire. We also find that in other study that houses that were not in bushfire prone area were also under amber attack and were ignited and were catching on fire. And when the house starting to burn, it can burn for hours and it produces a lot of flame, radiant heat, and embers that can attack other parts of the built environment, and it's become more more an urban type of fire in this case. So I'm not sure about how fast it's going to spread. It's going to depend also on some of the wind and the wind direction, but it would definitely spread from house to house if they're close enough, if there is enough fuel to burn in between.
Yeah, so I think Rafi's got that. It's sort of, we know that fires can penetrate 700 metres into urban areas. That happened in Hobart in 1967, and it penetrated long distances in Canberra as well. So that's without the bushfire. So the bushfire effectively stopped back at the edge of the urban area. So the spread of the fire, perhaps along creek lines or whatever, it could still be averaging sort of 10 to 15 kilometres an hour, but for short periods of time, the fire can spread much quicker than that. So for a couple of minutes, the fire could be spreading as fast as the wind. So what you perceive on the ground may be a fire spreading 200 or 300 metres, which is quite a distance when you're standing on the ground, in a minute or so. So whilst it may be averaging, say, 10 kilometres an hour, what happens in a minute or two can be much faster than that. It can be travelling as fast as the wind. So I think we need to separate out what the average rate of spread of the fire might be from relatively short distance. If you call 200 metres or 300 metres a short distance, what its spread can do. So that's sort of penetration that you need to be aware of. It's not just the average rate of spread of the fire.
And also the spot fires and the capacity to spot into those areas, so it's not just the path of the ground fire that's the issue, which does slow down in those areas, but the spot fires remain at a risk.
And that's where the 700 metres effectively comes from. It's from the spotting process.
Yeah.
Now, I think our next question is asking you to put your reputations on the line here. It says, what's the likelihood of a devastating fire on a code red day in Hurstbridge, Eltham or Diamond Creek? And then they've taken a stab at it. Is it 70% or higher? Kevin, you're a local.
Look, Hurstbridge, Eltham and Diamond Creek are probably a little less fire prone than somewhere like Warrandyte, Strathewen, St Andrews and so on, just because it's more fragmented and a little more densely built up. You could still have quite devastating fires in those areas, but the continuity of the vegetation to carry a head of bushfire is a bit less in those areas because of the density of the houses. So I'm not quite sure whether 70%, it's still a bushfire prone area. Trying to put a percentage on it, it's a bit hard, but you could expect significant losses there, but not to the same extent as, say, somewhere like St Andrews, Strathewen, even Warrandyte area.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in there who knows the area?
I'm from Frenchy girl, you know.
That's all right. We'll get the picture, I think. Now, this question wants to know, will COVID-19 make a difference to planning? Anyone want to have a go, Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we did see that was a major issue in other countries with fire events, where issues around evacuation became problematic, and really that overrode, I suppose, COVID concerns. So yes, it is an issue, and it's probably something that central authorities need to look at how they're going to manage that situation through this coming summer months, if there are still lockdowns, what they do, and it's certainly an added complication that we have to take into account, like, along with all the other complications with fire preparation.
Yeah, and I think it's an issue as well as we go into this next fire season, and all the sort of community meetings and all those things that would normally be happening face to face, where people can go ask questions and meet people and discuss all these things, just won't be happening.
And North America's sort of been through all of this the last few months, in a sense, and the part of the problem is you also have the threat to the firefighters themselves getting sick and so on, and being able to work in that sort of strenuous environment. So it has some impact there. I guess the other side of it, which is perhaps an up or a plus side of the COVID thing, I think we've seen a little more demonstration of science and evidence being used for decision-making process. From a scientist's point of view, I think that's been encouraging, but the trouble with bushfires is it tends to be a one-in-a-lifetime event, whereas with COVID, you can sort of see what happens 2 weeks after the decision's been made, and almost. But the COVID experience has perhaps heightened people's awareness of evidence-based decision-making, which could be a good thing from a fire point of view. So that's probably not what the questioner was aiming at, but I think COVID has some upsides to it.
This next question, I think it's one for you, Katherine. It says, I am concerned for those who have determined triggers. They make panic decisions late at variance to the plan. Could it be that it is necessary to learn that making sudden decisions is itself a trigger to pause and rethink? And I'm pretty sure you're interested in that too, Kevin. Kat, was there examples of that in your research?
So this is people who whose triggers for action just
they change them.
Oh,
and
they
the
change.
the changing of them is an indication that in fact they.
Oh, for sure. So people will think they've got a trigger, which might be, oh, it'll be, that high fire weather danger. And then a day will come and they'll think, there's no bushfires in the landscape. So I think I'm going to wait and see if a fire starts. So then that's the next day. And then a fire starts. I think, yeah, but it's not close enough to me. And I don't think it's going to reach me today. So I'm not going to leave. And so I think they'll go through all these triggers until suddenly, because what they're really looking for is certainty that their action to evacuate is worth the risk, so that they are going to be impacted by that fire. So I absolutely think that people will have a whole, selection of triggers that they will go through.
Kevin?
Yeah, well, I think from webinar, the last webinar you had, webinar 3, it's clear that unless, and Danielle was saying this a minute ago, unless you're actually practiced going through those processes, making those decisions, they won't be cemented in your brain in a sense. And so the logical process that you thought you were going through, if they're not ingrained and well-founded, then they're not very useful as triggers, because they're just wishful thinking in a sense, rather than something that's been practiced and tested. So Danielle might be better to answer that than me, but I think it's when you're under stress, making logical decisions is much more difficult than doing it in clear air.
Which is why I think practicing as many elements of your plan in non-fire circumstances is a good idea. So, see how you go preparing to pack up and get ready to leave on a day, and decide you're going to leave before 7 in the morning, and see how that goes, because most people find it's a lot more difficult than they think. So just set yourself the goal of practicing elements of those things. And once you've done that, it'll become a much more embedded practice, and then that will be the first thing that comes to mind, rather than the alternatives, as Kat was saying about waiting and seeing and deferring the decision until later. It's not as automatic.
Thank you all. Now look, there's one question here, and this is actually for me. People want to know what I did, what we did, that meant that we survived. Where did we take cover, and so on. Our house took about 20 minutes to burn. It was weatherboard. The time that we had once the house caught fire was spent looking for a dog that was actually inside. When we finally got outside, didn't find the dog, unfortunately. When we got outside, my utility was on fire, but I drove it down the road to get it away from the sheds in the house. I thought it'd be easy to put out. Diana got into her car, except her handbag was inside the house, which had burnt down, so the keys were there. Someone came and helped me put my ute out, and then we went up and got Diana. Our place was a grazing property. and so we weren't surrounded by bush, and so we were safe, and that's how we survived. My belief is plans A through to Q will probably fail, and that's why you need to have so many alternatives. Thank you, panelists. That was fantastic. Kevin, Catherine, Raphaele, and Danielle. To our participants, when you leave the webinar, you'll receive a short questionnaire which is designed to assist with making some improvements. Please respond as promptly as you can to those. And thank you to the members of Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, whose commitment continues to drive this webinar series. And special thanks to the CFA for access to the webinar platform and the technical assistance provided by Rowan Thornton. Thank you again to our sponsors, Nillumbik Shire Council, Safer Together, Diamond Creek Rotary, Davey Pumps and Water Equipment. And if you are a local community bank customer, then it's your banking which is making this and the other community sponsorships possible. And if you're not a customer, please call in at one of our 5 branches and have a chat about how you can bank local to build a stronger community. Tonight we had 157 participants. Thanks for joining us. Our next webinar will be 7:30 on Wednesday, the 15th of September, and we'll explore your sheltering options with Rafi, Kat, who'll be back, and they'll be joined by Chloe Begg from the CFA. So please join us again. Tell your friends to register if they don't already know about us. Thank you again to our panelists, and good night all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.